This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 341. Thank you for joining me for this special ingredient-focused episode of the podcast, brought to you interruption-free by longtime podcast supporters, BSG. This is year number 6 of BSG's support for the podcast. Super appreciate their support for bringing this podcast to you every week. As every brewer knows, BSG leads the way in the brewing industry by supplying the finest ingredients and supplies to brewers at competitive prices, and they are trusted by many of the most respected brewers in the craft community. Throughout today's episode, we're going to focus on ingredient innovation as it applies to the new IPA malt developed by Gambrinus, sold exclusively through in North America by BSG. We're going to walk through this the process of creating a new malt, the drive behind it, the development process, the use case for it, and we're going to get into how to brew with it and that creative side and sensory side and everything else. Joining me, Ashton Lewis, Manager of Training and Technical Support for BSG. Welcome to the podcast, Ashton.
Thanks for having me, Jamie. Looking forward to it.
Ashton's regular at our brewery accelerator brewery workshop events for breweries and planning. And so this is a little different context for us to have a conversation. Appreciate you joining me for it. Also joining us, Ken Smith, Director of Operations for Gambrinus Malting. Welcome, Ken, from Armstrong, BC.
Thanks, Jamie. I appreciate the opportunity.
Looking forward to diving into the process of creating this malt with you. Also joining us from the brewer's side, Blake Masoner, co-founder, head brewer for Craft Coast Beer and Tacos in Oceanside, California. Welcome, Blake.
Hey, Jamie. Thank you for having me. Stoked to be on here.
I'm glad we're finally getting to talk. Blake and I were hanging out down in Mexicali, Mexico, about 2 months ago, judging for the Copa Baja beer competition. He's holding up a bottle of beer as we speak, Mexican beer. We didn't get a chance to talk for the podcast there, but here we are now. And when the opportunity came to talk about this, I was glad that we were going to get to finally put a conversation out here onto the podcast. I'm excited to talk about this new approach to IPA brewing with IPA Malt from Gambrinus and RAR and BSG. I think the best place to start is the genesis of the idea. Ashton, there are lots and lots of different malts available to brewers today, unlimited ways to combine existing malts that help brewers achieve that flavor and technical performance that they're looking for in the beers they're making. Given this, talk to us about the thought process that drove the initial idea behind it. I mean, you have to have a problem, right? Products are created to solve problems. What problem were you all trying to solve in the development of IPA malt?
Well, the business case for it, or the brewing problem that we were trying to solve, keep in mind, I live in Missouri, so trends basically hit Missouri, later than anywhere else in the United States. So a lot of times the trends from like California never even make it all the way inland to Missouri. So from what I understand, and Blake, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the trend with IPA brewing is really kind of people are going back to West Coast style IPAs. Not that hazies are like going away, but there's been a kind of a renewed emphasis on West Coast. And the big difference now is that instead of having a West Coast IPA that has color, a lot of the West Coast IPAs 10 years ago really had a fair amount of crystal malt in them. A lot of color, a lot of crystal. But today, the brewers, particularly in Southern California, are brewing West Coast IPAs that are very, very blonde. So let's just start off with a question back to you, Blake. You agree with that trend?
Yeah. I mean, in San Diego, California, that's kind of our MO. We've been doing that for probably San Diego's been the industry leader for as long as I've been a part of it, and then well beyond my time as a brewer. So it kind of lends to the warm weather and sunshine that we have all year. You want to drink dry and crisp and light beers, but full flavor spectrum. And a lot of us brewers have moved away from the crystal malt trend and the colored malt, specialty malt trend, and it's all focused on nice base platform and let the hops do all the speaking. The dryness helps you, finish the drink. So that's what we're doing out here.
And that's really what the business case was on why we wanted to look at a malt for a style that's really starting to gain traction with a national focus on brewers doing this. And what we wanted to develop was a malt that was really pale in color, which a lot of the West Coast style IPAs these days are being brewed, really, which is Pilsner malt. But we wanted to have a malt that had a little bit more flavor than that Pilsner malt. So the hole in the base malt world that we were looking to fill was something that was low color, that has a little bit of malt character, that's just a little bit something extra. And it's not an overly malty malt, but it has more character than a Pilsner malt. And it doesn't have the color that you would have with like a pale ale malt or something like that.
Yeah, I guess you could even say even beyond West Coast IPA, even within hazy IPA, that pale light color is highly prized, and there are some that go for that deeper orangey tone, but man, that kind of pale, milky, light color is, it's what consumers now expect out of these beers, no matter really what they are, for that matter. But I'm curious, again, because you do have other malts like, Pilsner malt that can fill in that very light color thing. You do have other more flavorful malts in the, broader BSG portfolio, that can provide some of those flavor aspects. Talk to me about what, how you all wanted to bring these two things together. Why combine them, and some of the challenges that have come from trying to find one malt that can kind of span these pieces.
Well, before we get Ken to comment on some of the malting production levers that we can pull, one thing that I see is interesting thing in beer is that for the longest time, I mean, I'm kind of like an old school early 90s brewers when I got into brewing. And when I was a brewing student, literally, I went to UC Davis, and our way of brewing was basically you take base malt and then you make different colors and flavors using specialty malts. And there are a lot of terrific base malts in the world. We happen to carry a lot of those from Germany and Belgium and England and Ireland and Canada, the United States. And I think brewers these days are a lot more comfortable really focusing on the base malt and using less specialty malt. So we were kind of looking for a malt that would fit the need of this style of beer, West Coast IPA, but also other light colored beers like, Pilsners or Helles, really not a Pilsner, but maybe a Helles or like a Dortmunder export type beer. And that's the idea of the malt, a single malt that has all the package we need for that kind of brewing.
I think, what you say, it's interesting. If I think about, like, we have what we call, or what you all call, pale ale malt, which was driven by a prominent beer style, pale ale, that was a defining thing, 20, 30 years ago. Now, IPA, by any measure, is the defining beer, broader family. We can't even call it a style. There's so many styles within this giant family of styles. And it's taken a little while for, standard 2-row and pale ale malt can obviously be used, and now obviously Pilsner malt and any yeast from ale to lager yeast at this point can also be made to, used to make IPA. But it hasn't necessarily had a malt specifically designed for the style.
Yeah, totally. It's funny, without naming names, I'm gonna name a name. One of our good customers in San Diego area that had a slogan, something about fizzy yellow beer. And it's funny how the industry has kind of come full circle, where yellow beer is really the norm for a lot of craft beers these days. We've kind of gotten away from that color, and we're now making a lot of different beer flavors, but with more color uniformity.
Yeah, that fizzy yellow beer comment hasn't aged very well from, what's that, Greg
Yep.
from Stone, right? We'll name the names there. I think everyone's familiar with that quote. It's pretty ubiquitous at these points. And of course, look at how much lager that they're making now too. So here we are. If one thing you can say about craft beer is true, it's that never make ultimate pronouncements, because every brewer who does that will ultimately find themselves at some point in the future walking something back like that. We've seen it over and over again. Well, let's talk about this. I'm curious about this development process, because like I said, when I look at the stats, for this new IPA malt, some of the baseline stats, they really don't look that much different, from your standard, kind of two-row or pale malt. And so, from a kind of, structural or functional, like talk to me about what then differentiates this IPA malt and what you all have gone through. There's a myriad of things that, from barley varieties that you might be using to, that express differently, to different kinds of processing approaches. But I'm curious, how, what are some of the truly differentiating factors in IPA malt versus, some of these other somewhat similar malts in the BSG portfolio?
Well, the main difference on this is, number one, this is a North American barley, or it's Canadian, so we're North American. A lot of these paler colored malts from Europe have a lot of what I would consider kind of a grassy character, which is not a negative. But you drink a German Pilsner from this brewed with German Pilsner malt, and there's an unmistakable grassy character to a lot of those continental European malts. Now, in England, on the other hand, if you drink a lightly colored beer that's brewed with English malt or Scottish malt, they have quite a lot of flavor, and a lot of those beers have a real deep kind of biscuit, toasty character, even with light color. So, that's a type of malt. What we're looking for is a malt that is a little bit darker than Pilsner, because that is kind of a malt that's used a lot for this style of beer. But we wanted to have a little color differentiation. So we set our spec a little bit higher on color, and Ken's got the control of the magic in the malt house, where we wanted to pull some of the malting levers, some of the things that we can do in malting to give flavors that are kind of a little bit more of the toasty character that you would get from a darker malt. But, darker malts in this family of base, similar malts would be like a Vienna, which is probably the next color up from a Pilsner. Then we get into like a pale ale malt, which is darker and has more flavor. And then like a Gambrinus, we have a product which is ESB malt, which is kind of patterned after an English style malts for those kind of beers. So we were looking for something that was light in color, but a little bit more color than our standard base malts that we produce, but with more malt flavor.
Ken, why don't you talk about some of that development process? How do you go about then creating something that hits what Ashton is talking about, captures more of that kind of biscuity character of English malt without some of the grassiness of some of the continental malts, that keeps that light color, but also captures some of that flavor that you're looking for, that character in the malt itself.
Yeah, absolutely. First it starts with an idea, and Ashton and his team at RAR really came to us at Gambrinus with this idea. And so we started talking amongst our group and decided that it's probably something we could achieve based off of the, we'll call it the limited information at that time, mainly color, mainly flavor and aroma. Color for us is typically managed in part germination and part kiln. And so between those two, there's a balance between what the final outcome will be. One of the small rules we use in malting is moisture and heat makes color. And so we want to make sure that we're entering the kiln at the right moisture levels in order to achieve those colors we want while maintaining the off-kiln moisture levels in the malt itself. So that takes some design and talk, and really it comes down to that particular thing, to the maltsters every day going into the beds and taking moisture samples and figuring out how many wet passes and how much fan and airflow we need, and basically carrying that all the way through germination and into the kiln steps. Color, I would say, even though it is impacted by the entire process. It's largely and mostly impacted in the kilning process. So we talked about the recipes, specific recipes in the kiln, and adjusted those to hopefully kind of land us on. And I think, Ashton, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like 2.2 SRM is kind of what we're targeting, which would be for us higher than a Pilsner, lower than a Pale, lower than ESB. And then it comes down to the aromas and stuff. And this is where it gets a little more magical, because at the end of the day, we can test for almost every element of performance within a malt in a laboratory, whether it's beta glucans, cobalt value, whatever it may be. But we still need the human to get in there and taste it and smell it and really see if this is what we're trying to get at. So we really early on started with the kind of walking through the germination with the goal of getting a darker product, and then finishing in the kiln with the goal of getting a lighter product. And then combining those two and taking it to the lab and getting our teams together, both at the RTC, the RAR Technical Center, our product development team, and our own staff at Gambrinus, and just tasting it, hanging out, tasting it. And we're doing blind tests, writing down what we feel, how, and everyone's going to have a different opinion on what it tastes like or what it smells like, but there's a general consensus as well. And so we made, varying changes throughout the process, throughout the months we were developing it. And once we found, we'll call it a result that we were excited about, we then had to mimic it and redo it, right? I mean, one of the things that brewers expect of us, doesn't matter the size of the malt house, is consistency. And they're going to want, if they like it, they're going to want to make sure that they get the same thing next time. And so we were able to land on something we liked, but now we had to recreate it. And we have to keep recreating it. And so really it comes down, to summarize that, I guess, is there is the malting proprietary stuff that we do with our malts, and we honed in on color and taste and aroma. And then since then, once it was sort of accepted by, we'll say, Ashton and his team, we needed to start reproducing that same product. So it really comes down to a
I'm
huge
fascinated
group effort.
by this. Like, I can understand brewing in a process with a smaller pilot system, but do you have small pilot malt systems, similar to that, to let you do small batches? Because otherwise, like, you're talking about pretty big production equipment. Do you have small, pilot malt systems that can also, where you understand how those scale to your large systems? Do you have ways of testing these small variables as they change so that you can do head-to-head testing, or even test different barley varieties or what? I'm curious about this innovation process. It's just something that's new to me.
That's an amazing question. That's a great question. Gambrinus is arguably the smallest industrial malt house in North America. We have fairly small batch sizes to begin with, in and around 26 to 30 metric tons. When you compare that to some of our sister plants like in Shakopee and Alex, it's significantly smaller. So in some respects, we're a low risk R&D site for RAR. And so our batch sizes are kind of test sizes anyways. But to answer your question, yes, we absolutely have that. At the RTC, we have like a full pilot malting system that we can use. We also have smaller systems. Ashton, you might want to chime in on the size of those. I'm not quite sure, but they're fairly small, in the hundreds of kilograms. And then at our site, we also have a small system we can do for about 5 kilograms if we really want to test. But that being said, we've been doing this a long time, and we're part of the RAR family, and they got 175 years of experience and knowledge and education. And so we can actually almost go right to production with these ideas at a fairly low risk. With the amount of people and the huge team behind us, it really does lower that risk. So in this case, we just went full straight to big, to a 29 ton batch. We were pretty confident in where we were headed, based off our experiences with the other malts, that we wouldn't, be, quote unquote, wasting a batch. So in the end, we kind of took that risk. We said, hey, this is kind of what we're looking for. Let's try it out. And I think the first batch we weren't that happy with, and I think the second batch we honed in a little bit more on what we liked, and at that point we started doing the bigger sensory program with all the other teams. And then since then, I think it's been at least a half a dozen batches that I would call successful. And for us, if we have to, and we've done this in the past with other products, not to deviate from the IPA too much, but we've done, since RAR has acquired Gambrinus, we've done a honey oats and a rye. And we did much smaller batches with that. We did utilize the other systems that were available to us rather than trying to dive in on such a big scale with those particular products. But this one, we just felt a lot more comfortable and confident with it because although it was new, it wasn't necessarily a huge deviation from what we typically do today, unlike an oat, which was brand new to our operations. And so, again, for us, it was a confident stride into a new product development.
Yeah, just to comment from a brewer's perspective, what Ken's talking about is really, it is cool. And you're interested in that, Jamie. You talk about beer a lot, but like at RAR, we have multiple pilot systems at RAR at the technical center. And when there's a crop change, we do what's called micro malting. And the micro malting is literally on like 100 grams of malt. We really were small. I'm not exactly sure the volume, but they're very, very, very small batch sizes. And that's to really assess the barley itself. How does it grow? And it's kind of it's not really scalable. But then we have a pilot system in the RTC that is larger. That's a 150 kilogram system. So we have a 3 hectoliter brew house at the RTC. So with 150 kilos of malt, we can definitely brew more than a 3 hectoliter batch. But what's really interesting with what a lot of maltsters do is that just like beer, you brew like, say, a 5-gallon homebrew batch, call that a test batch, and then you're going to scale it up to 10 barrels or 20 barrels, whatever. It doesn't scale up very easily. It's difficult. So there's another method that we use at RAR we call them strainer bags. And we'll actually take like barley samples and we put them in a bag, just think of like a mesh bag you use for home brewing, and that gets steeped in with a regular steep, and then the strainer bag gets manually picked up, and we put it into the germination box with a full batch size, which at Shakopee is like 250 metric tons, which is like 500,000 pounds of barley. And these little strainer bags are in there as test, and then we take the strainer bag and put it in a kiln, and it's really pretty cool because we have to, like Ken said, people expect consistent product, and we do our darndest, year after year to have crop transfers without major changes in color and flavor and modification.
Oh, that's really fun. So just like a brewer would throw, adjunct ingredients in a bag in a tank, you're throwing those grains in a bag into the main bed of, that's cool. I have been to the technical center in Shakopee and seen that it's a very cool research facility that you guys have up there. 100%. Is there something to this IPA malt in terms of, or tell me about the barley, varieties that go into this varieties. I'm on, I'll let you all answer that question since it's, that's more your expertise than mine. Is there something to that, or are these, just generally, the same kinds of, barley varieties grown just for agronomic purposes, in the same malts that Gambrinus uses in other ways?
For us at Gambrinus, we're located in Western Canada, so we neighbor Alberta. Alberta produces arguably some of the best malting barley on the planet. But primarily what we use is Synergy, Copeland, Connect, Fraser. There's not a whole lot of different varieties available to us. I think there's more options in other areas of the world. But for us, it's more of a focus on the varieties that will they'll influence the flavor and the color development that we're looking for. So we don't necessarily commit to just a single variety. We won't mix varieties within production, but each batch will at least be of a single variety. And we're not necessarily married to one over another. We use the best available variety or the best available barley that is available that crop season, regardless of variety. And it sometimes changes. Historically, we've used Copeland for our Pilsners. In the last couple of years, we've used Synergy. We're seeing a lot of benefits from Synergy in terms of less pests and other kinds of complications that can arise from, it's an agricultural product. So you got all kinds of things from Dawn and those kinds of things. So we're typically
getting something that grows really well that also doesn't require a ton of fertilizer, so you're not dumping tons of nitrogen and causing all sorts of other issues. Like having something that works agronomically is ultimately going to be, the best thing, for the
absolutely, and that's our primary approach to it. we're lucky that the varieties that we do have access to are great varieties. I mean, there's no doubt that they benefit our flavor profiles we're looking for, and they help us achieve the colors we're looking for. And in our province in BC, it's even more limited. So I would say most of our grain is coming from the Alberta region, and today it would mostly be Synergy. It could change tomorrow, though. It's hard to say, but Synergy the last couple of years has provided us with great yield, low proteins, and a reliable and a consistent variety that allows us to also be reliable and consistent.
Well, the talk about variety is interesting. There's some maltsters that do focus on varieties, and like Ken said, that's not our focus, because we do want to have crops that are really sustainable for where they're grown. And RAR has very close relationships with our growers. So RAR and Gambrinus, being part of the same company, work together through our grower network. We have agronomists that work with our growers. So we want our growers to be successful. The other thing we want our growers to do is keep on growing malting barley, because there's a lot of other crops that can be grown in Alberta. Just to put it in context, Alberta as a province in Canada produces more malting barley than all of the United States combined. So Alberta is a huge, for North America, very, very important province. And we want those farmers growing malting barley. So we want them to be successful, and we want to make the best product we can using what they're able to grow on their farms.
Let's. I want to talk a little bit about the sensory. Ken, you all mentioned that as you guys are tasting these as a team, as you're going through these testing, you have this broader idea, this broader goal for coming up with a more English style, flavor, bready, nutty, rather than grassy. As you all are tasting it, what's some of the sensory feedback when used in this kind of in this IPA context? How are your teams describing these flavors, again, especially as they find some finding some space for difference from some of the other malts that you all make, like a Pilsner or a two-row or a pale ale malt?
Again, that's a great question. I think Ashton could probably answer it more clear than me, but I'll give you my 2 cents as well. When our staff is trying it, myself included, we definitely had a Pilsner-esque Vienna, if that makes sense. You have that sort of light, sweeter elements that come with a Pilsner, and some of the more grainier elements that you would get from a darker malt like a Vienna. One thing I've realized as a maltster, and in full transparency, I'm not a brewer, so I can only speak from the angle of a maltster. We typically have our own internal what it tastes to a maltster, and then a brewer may have a completely different experience with what they're tasting and what they're smelling. So we tend to not, as maltsters, tell brewers what they should experience. We'll give them some ideas on performance. We'll give them some ideas on what we're seeing, what our goals are. But we always also want to hear back on what the industry is experiencing with that product. But from our perspective at Gambrinus, with our small team there, it was definitely more the sweeter undertones, the grainier, darker tones that you get from a more kilned product. But Ashton, please add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the flavors that I kind of emphasize on this is like distinguishing characters kind of fall into the cracker, slightly nutty, a little, I'm going to say honey, but not how we perceive honey a lot of times on the tongue, but how we get honey in the nose, which is a little bit of a fruity, kind of a sweet character. I mean, that we smell, so fruity, from the pollen that honey comes from. And really what those, to put it in science terms, those were all Maillard reaction products. And when Ken was talking about, changing the moisture and the temperature, even starting in germination through, starting in steeping through germination and then going into the kiln, that's really what's being influenced are the amount of reducing sugars and free amino nitrogen that goes into the kiln, where we pick up these Maillard reaction products in kilning. If you contrast that to, let's say, a Pilsner malt, especially a European style Pilsner malt, that the modification is held back. So they typically have low soluble to total protein, or we call that the Kolbach index, a little bit on the lower side. So those malts will pick up less color and also develop less flavor on the kiln. So this malt, from what Ken was describing, is going to be a little bit more modified in kilning, and that's where those characters come from. And I think Blake can probably speak to, to those that actually show up in beer, because when we're sipping on wort or smelling wort or chewing on grain, we have to imagine what's it going to taste like when these sweet characters that we taste in the grain are turned into alcohol and CO2 in beer.
Let's talk about that, Blake. From in a sensory perspective, you brew with Pilsner malt, you brew with standard 2-row. You've now brewed with an early iteration of this IPA malt. From your sensory perspective, where does it land in this spectrum, and how do you describe, what it does within the context of your clean and crisp San Diego style IPA?
So I guess when we kind of got approached by BSG to use this malt, I was obviously interested because from a brewer perspective, from my personal perspective, I like to use a variety of different malts from different suppliers, different maltsters, whether it's Pilsner, 2-row, some English malt, Golden Promise, Maris Otter. We use all of it depending on what we're trying to achieve. And so when we got approached to use this IPA malt for the first time, it kind of got my gears turning. It's like, what's it going to taste like? I kind of got the general overview of what was trying to be achieved in the malt. And basically from opening up the bags, definitely did have like a nice light character, but it had flavor. As a San Diego brewer, we're always looking for a pretty stripped down flavor profile. However, I guess my preference in beer is a little bit different than some of my counterparts in San Diego. I like a little bit more malt character. I'm fine with a, slightly higher terminal gravity, little bit of body, little bit of balance. And I felt like from what I got from this malt, a lot of that came through on the final product, and it came through even in the process side on the brew house. It was very easy. In the lauter, it cleared up nicely in the Vorloff. So it was kind of a cool thing to test out. You never know quite what to expect when you're using a new malt for the first time, but I was excited because we're always trying to achieve something a little bit different with each beer. And at my brewery, we're not married to one malt. We don't have a silo. We buy every batch that's intended for each beer. So I feel like a lot of the things that they were trying to achieve, I was noticing myself, and then having later conversations about what they were trying to achieve. I was like, oh yeah, I tasted a very nice light profile up front, but then there was a noticeable amount of sweetness, malt character, but it wasn't dark. It was just there, And so we've since brewed with it again and added a little bit more layer to it this time. And it works well, with however you kind of want to do it. But
when you say added more layer, what's that mean?
So on the initial batch, we basically used it as a single malt, cited sigillated malt adjustment just to help with mash pH and stuff like that. Kept it very stripped down, focused on just the profile of that one malt. And then on this subsequent batch, we went a little bit deeper and we put in some flaked oats, which is an adjunct that you'll see in pretty much all of Craft Coast, West Coast IPAs. And that's going back to what I said earlier about having a preference for a little bit more body, a little bit more balance, a little bit more character overall, because I feel like with the way that we hop through the kettle and through the dry hop, we can kind of get away with having a little bit more sweetness because we're going so heavy, on those hopping rates.
If you're jamming a ton of hops in there, then you need some additional flavor and support and body and whatnot.
Right. I came from the family of Pizza Port brewers who's been on the innovation side. They were using Pilsner malt and IPA before anyone else, and when I joined that company and started to learn, the ways of the industry, that was our MO. It was like very light, very dry, super hoppy IPA. And I felt like once I started to come into my own and develop my own personality as a brewer, I felt like I desired a little bit more balance. And so I pulled my bitterness back a little bit and started adding, oats and wheat, maybe something a little bit specialty in there, whether it's like a Carahel or light Munich or, even Cara Malt, just something to give it more. And so when malts like this are developed specifically for IPA, it's pretty nice to know that you can just create your normal base platform of what works and then substitute in this new product. And then you're essentially getting an entirely new beer. And that's what excites us, like how many beers do we need that's RAR 2 roast, silo malt, and a bag of dextrose, that kind of can get old after a while.
Or dropping in 1 or 2% of something just to tweak, give it a little bit of color difference, so that when somebody is lining up their flight of IPAs, the beers appear differently to them, right? I guess it's a little easier to do it this way.
Yeah, it's not just swapping out, X, Y, and Z hop. You're now swapping out an entire base malt, and that will influence the way that you're going to hop your beer at that point. We like to use adjuncts, but we're still finding like a terminal gravity of anywhere around 2 Plato down to 1.7, I think is probably our cutoff, which is still fairly dry, but it's packed in with a little bit of adjunct. So you get a little more body. It's perceived bigger and a little more full than the beer actually is, but that just helps you. In my opinion, that helps us be able to have a more drinkable beer, something that's not cloying on your tongue and overly bitter or overly astringent. So this IPA malt really helped balance what I like in IPA, which is super hoppy. You could go aggressive, and then you still get a nice undertone of malt character, which I don't want to see go away, even though I'm in the mecca of making that go away, I guess. So,
Blake, things never truly leave. Like, they just move in cycles, and they move in different kinds of, things are just, for every action, there's some other, reaction and and we even call it opposite. Like, those are just small movements. Plus, you're all brewers, right? You can't do everything the same way the entire time. That'd get really boring. Talk to me about fermentation with this. It, generally works in the same kind of fermentation approach that you use for your other West Coast IPAs.
Yeah, pretty much we found for this beer the whole goal. I say this beer, the beer that we brewed with BSG that was using the IPA malt. The goal was to use entirely BSG provided products. So it actually lined up with what we do consistently, where we use a lot of fermentous dry yeast. So we picked up some USO5 from them, and we ferment just as we would any other beer. We like to do 65 degrees, and then eventually, once we creep towards terminal gravity, we'll bump up a little bit. Harvest yeast, and then put a big dry hop in around day 7 to day 10, depending on what we're trying to go for. From what I've found, being a brew pub and being able to constantly brew different kinds of IPA recipes, but with the same baseline of fermentation and cellar practice, we're getting like completely different beers just by swapping ingredients and dry hop process. So we're still getting, like I mentioned a little bit ago, a 2 Plato to 1.8, 1.7 Plato terminal, but this beer lended a little bit more malt character. It was still dry, but you could taste malt. Some of our other IPAs, bone dry, and all you taste is a crazy hop load. So it's fun to see kind of what other things can do, in that realm. So
Are there, brewers in Southern California that I've talked to, or California in general, some are absolutely thinking about malt use in the way that it relates to hops that they're selecting and using in specific beers. When it comes to this IPA malt, there's some of those hops that may have a stronger character, where you find having a little bit more character in the malt might help support them, versus those hops where like this just needs something super clean and straight up a Pilsner.
right. That's a good question, because I feel like the first time we brewed it, I was definitely trying to achieve something a little bit just based off of technical spec that I got and sensory spec. I was expecting the malt to be a little bit sweeter than it was, so there's a decent bittering addition in there. We used some CO2 extract midway through the kettle, and then put in a whirlpool and then another active ferment dry hop. And I feel like, the goal was to achieve using the hops with enough bitterness to block the sweetness that we thought was going to happen and to balance it out. But really, we didn't need to do that as aggressively as we did, because the malt itself just provides flavor, but it's very dry and crisp, as a Pilsner would be. So, on the second go around, we're like, all right, let's pair it up with the hops that we're a little bit more familiar with in West Coast IPA that will provide just that classic, orange dank, citrus. So we put, Mosaic and Citra in there heavy. And then we tried the new anchovy hop, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, like I want to keep using the malt because it's really fun, and I feel like it does lend more towards those quintessential West Coast IPAs, Citrus, Simcoe, Mosaic. You definitely could use it with Nelson Nectar on any of those, and you don't need to really worry about this perceived sweetness that you get when you taste the malt, because the beer does dry out, and you're left with just a nice balanced malt character. I wouldn't say it's nutty or caramely in any way. It's just present. There is malt present, but the beer is very dry. So the hops can still do the talking, leaves you with a color that's very balanced and nice, Sometimes Pilsner malt based IPA, you don't have enough going on. It's not interesting enough. And I think some people try and do that a little bit too much, and you almost get left with a beer that's a little bit too dull and one-dimensional. And some of my favorite beers are a little bit, I guess I keep saying balance. Balance is what I like, and I think the malt does that well. So,
well, your plug walk, the beer you brewed the first time with this malt, to me, it had a real nice golden color. I mean, it had a depth to the. Let's say it has a yellow color, but it had kind of a deeper yellow than. To me, some really pale Pilsners almost, this is kind of a negative description, but kind of remind me of like dishwater. It's kind of like this, it's clear, but it's got kind of a weird, just kind of tint to it. But as that the plug wall, kind of really nice golden, almost like it was shining a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. It did kind of move somewhere in between, the Pilsner straw and two-row light yellow gold. I think some of that too comes from, different brew house and different process. Our kettle we have a condensing steam stack, so we're not naturally escaping steam vertically out of a stack. We're actually having to pull a vacuum, condense that down back into water, and then it goes down the drain. So we get a very aggressive boil. And I think that's why we're always very careful about how much malt character we're putting into our grain bill and how much bitterness we're putting into our kettle, because we're getting such a rigorous boil. We do, after every batch, we try and add a little bit of water back into the kettle to dilute down some of those, reactions that occur there. And I felt like with that malt, it just came out kind of what you're expecting, just right in that pale gold color without, getting too much over caramelization from the boil. So that is something that we definitely always keep an eye on, just because we, the type of building that we're in, we can't escape our steam stack just straight out the roof. We had to get creative. So it was cool to see that malt on a brew house like that. I felt like overall it was what we wanted. It cleared up, proteins bound well in the whirlpool, and we just pulled a nice clean wort into the fermenter. And then once it hit on tap, it was like very, very clear and still carried all those great flavors, which was super cool. So I felt like overall it was a fun trial to be a part of. And then I wanted to use it again. And so here we are brewing with it even more.
As a maltster, you're saying all the right things. I got a question for you though that I gotta ask. I'm not familiar with anchovy hops. Can you elaborate on anchovy hops a little bit?
Let's see. I don't know where to start. I guess one of my buddies and fellow Pizza Port Lost Abbey family member, Steve Burchill, that works for Hollingberry. We were hanging out and talking about hops and whatnot and what we were doing at Craft Coast. And he's like, hey, we have this new hop. It's called anchovy. And you should try it. So I thought it was
Does
weird.
Does it taste like anchovies?
No, it doesn't. So I of course.
So they it was named by, I think it was Strumpke, Brian Stillwater Strumpke, and then Matt from Fast Fashion, right? I think it was the two of them that came up with the anchovy name, and it was really a test to see, could they name it something so horrible that brewers still would have to, they'd still want to use it, but also, kind of you put that on a label, it's made with anchovy hops. I mean, you're gonna get people to ask some questions, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of like the shock factor.
Yeah, it definitely took me straight to the internet to figure out why it was called that, because I personally don't think that's the best idea, but the hop on paper is great, and so far in the beer, it's awesome. So it, of course,
I'm glad it didn't taste like fish.
No, not at all. It smelled rad. But yeah, definitely led me to the internet, and I was like, again, another good experiment, new malt, new hop, put them together, and let's see what happens, and let's create a new beer and come up with a crazy name for it that nobody understands, and put it on tap, let people drink it. That's kind of what we do.
Sure. Ashton, beyond West Coast IPA, as we've said, like the current trend, Blake, you see these even with, with hazy IPA, pale is very in and of the moment, even in hazy IPA, and having some of that malt character, especially with the even higher adjunct loads, typically in a hazy IPA or something that where this malt can work very effectively. Do you guys see other brewers now interested in this malt or brewing with this malt in the hazy IPA style or even in other beer styles?
Well, we're going to be launching this very, very soon. It actually hasn't launched yet, so we're launching this at the beginning of February. So we're actually just getting ready to launch. But yeah, it's like anything else. You name it's even like a beer style. You call something a Pilsner, and people have a preconceived notion of what it's going to taste like, which I guess that kind of is the point of a beer style in a certain sense. But not all there's different hops that Pilsners use, and some Pilsners have more body residual sweetness than others do. And it's like that with naming a malt. You put a name on a malt, although this is developed for IPA, it doesn't mean that brewers are limited to how they're going to use it. So we do expect, number one, because it is called IPA malt, that the brewers will use it for, all the different IPAs that people brew, including hazies. But also, just talking through the flavor profile, I'm a big lagerhead, and when I think of a malt like this, my mind goes straight to Helles. I think that a German Helles has some of those characters of a little bit. That's what a Helles is, a little bit more than a Pilsner or a Dortmunder export. Or even I was recently in Belgium and just really, really enjoyed their golden strong ales and their triples, which for whatever bizarre reason have kind of fallen out of favor in the United States. But I think that this malt will be really nice in a strong golden ale, which you would definitely want to augment that with some sugar. So maybe 12 to 14 Plato from malt, and then bump up the OG with sugar. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that our customers will be playing around with. This, if you're listening to this podcast, please don't put fish in it. Don't put lactose and frazzleberries or whatever. We do want this beer to be used for beer flavored beer, if I can say that.
You can't make them do that, Ashton. People, they can brew whatever the hell they want to brew with this
do what we want. We're doing what we want.
We'd like it though to have, I love it, when Blake's talking about the beer flavor and the malt flavor. To me, that just speaks to me as a beer consumer.
Well, the fact that it's Gambrinus and that Gambrinus, even within the Pilsner space, I've had conversations with brewers about West Coast Pils here on the podcast, and the Firestone folks, Sam Tierney, they've talked about that Gambrinus Pilsner malt always finishing pretty low in that 1.7-ish, finishing gravity range. So that Gambrinus has a reputation for drying, but the idea of being able to finish dry and also finish dry with a malt character, that's an interesting function. And certainly, like you mentioned in that space of Helles, being able to reach that dryness, but still carrying malt character with it does, create some interesting opportunities for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Jamie, just to add a little bit to that too, one of the goals was to make sure that this malt could be used at 100% inclusion rate as well. So you can use it on its own, or like Blake has so elegantly explained, with other things as well. And but the bottom line was to make it a base malt that had a different flavor profile than the other base malts on the market.
What's the DP on this, Ken? Do you have that number handy?
Yeah, I'll dig it up.
Because one thing with there's a pretty good variability of diastatic power among malts, not only in North America but the world. And a lot of the malts we produce at RAR are kind of middle of the road on DP. They're definitely not hot, which, some malts are really, really hot, hard to control. So, but I think that the DP is something that really is useful to look at. And especially if you're using adjuncts, keeping an eye on, making sure there's enough enzyme to do what you want to do, but maybe not too much where you can't control your mash.
Yeah, and diastatic power for IPA, we targeted our similar base malts with a max around 120, so I should say greater than 120. And looking at the most recent off-kiln batches, we're sitting around 130.
Oh, so that actually is, that's a little bit higher than I thought on that.
What does that mean? What does that mean in a practical sense, Ashton?
Well, in a practical sense, most of our malts are in the probably 120 to 130 range. When I say our malts, at RAR and Gambrinus, most of our base malts are in that range. When the diastatic power is higher, let's say 150 or greater, the amount of enzymatic activity, so diastatic power is just an overall measure of all the enzymes, you end up with a mash that's got so much enzyme that if you want to have a less fermentable wort, it becomes actually kind of difficult to control. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of beers these days are so dry, is that malt enzymes have gone up, particularly with breeding and also total protein.
So what you're saying is that with a proper mash regimen, you actually could, maybe get this to finish a little bit sweeter, if that was your goal.
Yeah, with a DP at 130, that's a pretty respectable enzyme complement. You could mash, hotter and thinner would be two ways. Hotter, thinner, and shorter would be ways of controlling wort fermentability.
Ashton, as we were talking a couple weeks ago, planning for this episode, you mentioned to me that you even went out completely on left field in a batch that you brewed and made a Rauch beer with this malt.
Yeah, I made actually 2 Rauch beers with it. I did a smoked Helles, which I thought turned out really nice. And it was a warm fermented Helles, so I used Fermentus W3470 the Weinstoffen lager yeast. And I think my basement at that time was about 18 Celsius, which is like, what is that, like 65 or 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which the 3470 actually works quite well at warm temperature. And then I also made a smoked Hefeweizen with it. So I used the IPA base malt with some wheat malt and Weizen yeast, and then a smoked Weizen.
And it worked just fine with that much more expressive yeast then.
Yeah, and of course I was diluting this malt quite a bit with the in the case of the smoked Weizen, not only with the smoked malt, which I used about 20%, but also with the wheat malt.
Interesting. Well, we've been talking for a while on this. Any thoughts, about opportunities for this? About what you hope to see, Blake, about what you've got, planned next for it, and what the future may look like with IPA Malt?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, just in the social media realm, every time I post about something that has to do with it, a couple brewers will hit me up and ask how it is and when they could get it, how they could get it. So there's definitely interest, especially from guys who are making what I consider some of the best IPAs in the country. And for me to get the opportunity to brew with it early, it was super cool, because now I think it'll probably find its way into my brew house more frequently, especially on some of the beers that are more desired, or more geared towards single malt, single hop application. Because you are getting a diverse malt that does multiple things, you're left with a little bit more, on the meat on the bone for the beer. So I think from a brewer perspective, it's a good idea. We should always be searching out new ingredients and new flavor profiles and new opportunities to try something new. And it's what keeps the industry fresh, and it's what keeps me personally as a brewer fresh, always, trying new stuff. And not just because of opportunity to brew a beer. It's like that should be the goal with most brewers, in my opinion. It doesn't always just have to work and you're good with it. There's always an opportunity to find something new, and you might end up liking it more than what you're currently doing, and then you pivot. So yeah, I think it's exciting. Just as we always try new hops and new hopping techniques and incognitos and 702s and everything, we can try new malt as well. So that's my brewer plug.
Always be learning, right? Yeah. Ken, what do you
always.
Ken, what do you hope to see from brewers using this new malt that you all at Gambrinus have played such a strong role in creating?
What we hope to see is we hope to get feedback from brewers to get a real understanding of what brewers are thinking of the product. It's in its infancy, and it's going to evolve as we go. So that feedback is paramount to the success, and we're really looking forward to see what brewers do with the product, what they think of the product, and give us some ideas on how we could improve on it. And most importantly, I think we always enjoy sampling the products that the breweries are making with our malt. So any brewers out there who do end up using this malt, if you're interested in sending, some samples to us to taste as a team, we're always open to the idea.
Close the loop, right? Close the loop. Ashton, obviously this podcast is out about a week before this hits the market. If customers, current BSG customers or not current BSG customers want to learn more about getting some IPA malt into their own brew houses, what should they be doing?
Well, the best thing to do would be to reach out to their sales rep at BSG, which is usually our customer service representative, is that common contact. Or if there are people listening to the podcast that are not BSG customers, you can go to our website and put in a customer, set up a new account. But we're going to have this in all of our warehouses in the United States. In fact, we've already got malt moved to all the warehouses in the United States, and we have it in all the warehouses in Canada. So we're ready to roll. We're really looking forward to people doing exactly what Ken said, is just check it out, let us know what you think about it. And for us, it's exciting. It's fun developing a new product and working as a team, and In this case, it was a team effort with RAR in Minnesota and Ken's team up in Canada. And then Blake played a really critical role in helping us actually taste some beer that was made with this new malt. And I mean, his beers are great. And the Plug Walk IPA was really stellar. We had our company annual sales meeting literally next door to Craft Coast. And I think we put a pretty big dent in that tank during the time that we were there and really enjoyed the beer.
Well,
yeah, that was great.
Yeah. I guess it's time to let her rip. Well, thank you all for joining me for this special IPA malt focused episode of the podcast. Once again, brought to you interruption free by our friends at BSG. As Ashton said, visit bsgcraftbrewing.com for more information. If you're a BSG customer, reach out to your rep today. Try out this new malt, or at least get on the list as soon as it starts shipping out there in February. If you're not a customer, then obviously follow all the steps on the website to become one, because you don't want to miss out, right? Malt's not just great for IPA. You know, as you all say on the site, cream ale, golden ale, blonde ale, or if you're crazy like Ashton, you can even make a Rauk beer with it. Blake, Ken, Ashton, thanks to all of you all for sharing your thoughts on IPA malt, this new Gambrinus IPA malt. It's been great talking with all of you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.